The concept here, though, is very simply to make it so that someone who, for example, has a visual impairment or an auditory impairment is going to be able to still access your website. So again, think about it in those terms of making it clear and easy for people to recognize.
Welcome to the Online Genius Podcast, where host and renegade-thinking beer-brewing lawyer turned online entrepreneur Bobby Klinck proves that building and protecting your online genius doesn't have to be rocket science. Bobby and his expert guests break down online marketing and the legal stuff so you can stop sweating the small stuff and get back to building your amazing business. Now, here's your host, Bobby Klinck.
Hey there. Welcome to episode 54 of the Online Genius Podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Klinck, and today's show will dig into an issue that we all need to be thinking about as online entrepreneurs, and it's kind of a hot topic that I've been hearing about lately, so I'm glad it's coming where it is in kind of the rotation here. Now, it's a legal-themed show that fits in with our current overall theme of content strategy. For most of us, the hub for all of our content will be our website. Now, that doesn't mean all of our content is exclusively there, but we're going to point back to our website quite a bit. And there are some legal requirements that we need to talk about when it comes to our website. Specifically, today, we're going to be talking about the thorny issues that have kind of been cropping up lately about the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, and how that applies to our websites. Now, like I said, I've gotten pinged about this a few times recently, and so it's definitely going to keep popping up, so it's something you need to understand. But before we dive into this week's episode, this episode is brought to you by the Online Genius podcast community on Facebook. Again, that's where we can go deeper. That's where you'll get a chance to interact with me and other people who are trying to build and protect their online business the right way. It's a place where you can get access to freebies, you can ask me questions, you can get answers to burning issues that come up. Now, this is an area where sometimes I'll get ideas for podcast episodes if I'm seeing questions come up there. So it is a great place for you to get access to me and information about the marketing side and the legal side. If you'd like to join, you can do so free by heading over to youronlinegenius.com/community. Again, that's youronlinegenius.com/community. That'll redirect you over to Facebook. And just make sure to answer the questions when you ask to join the group, because if you don't answer, I won't let you in. Now, I don't really care what the answers are within reason. I just want to make sure you answer, right? So I want to make sure that you take that time. So again, head on over to youronlinegenius.com/community and ask to join. Now let's dig in to today's episode. And look, I'm not going to lie to you. The ADA website compliance issues, it's thorny. It's not an easy issue, but I'm going to do my best to break it down into really understandable concepts. And I'm going to, kind of help you understand the why and what the rules are, or what the kind of the idea of the rules are, even though it's not exactly clear. At the end of the day, though, I'm going to tell you, a lot of this ends up being kind of technical stuff. And so you're going to need to dig into it a bit, either with your web developer, if you have someone who's developing your website, or with the people who are creating your web technology, for example, your theme and all of those things, to make sure that they're kind of helping you comply with these pieces. So you're going to need to kind of do a deeper dive here, because there's a lot of pieces here, but I'm going to give you a broad overview to get you started. So let's dive in. Now, first, I want to talk about what is the ADA and what in the world does it have to do with your website? Because this is a question that I think a lot of people, are asking. And candidly, if you would have asked me, even a year or two ago, I would have said it probably doesn't apply to us. But I want to tell you that's not necessarily clear anymore. Now, broadly speaking, the ADA is a law that was meant to prohibit discrimination against people based upon their disability. And there's a lot of parts to it that don't apply to us. So there's things about employment and things about government, et cetera. But there's also a part that says that we should remove access barriers to places of public accommodations. And again, I say should. It's not should. It's you're required to. And so what does that mean? Well, access barriers, obviously that's kind of something that would prevent people from being able to access whatever is a place of public accommodation. Now, when this was originally passed, people were thinking about physical barriers and physical spaces. So think of staircases and narrow halls and things like that would have prevented someone in a wheelchair, for example, from being able to access a building. And so that's why we have wheelchair ramps. That's why we have all of those kinds of accessibility aids these days in new buildings and building codes. Now, here's the problem, though. Does that apply to us? And in the past decade or so, there really has been a move to expand this out to say it applies to websites as well. It kind of started almost a decade ago, back in 2010, when the Justice Department here in the United States said it was going to create some rules and regulations that would apply. This is kind of how they said, hey, we're going to make rules. It's a very long drawn out process under what's called, the Administrative Procedure Act of setting rules, etc. So they were going to do that. But in the meantime, they started taking action. Even without rules, they started going after people and saying, hey, you have to comply with the ADA on your website. And so there's been a lot of this that's kind of been percolating recently. Now, here's where I want to kind of get a bit deeper here. Now, now we're to a point, I should say, where pretty much everybody, court-wise and everybody else, accepts that the ADA does apply to websites. There's really no doubt about that. So if you as a business owner are required to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, generally, pretty much everyone agrees your website has to comply as well. But here's the sticking point. There's disagreement about whether the Americans with Disabilities Act would apply to you or I as online businesses if we do not have a brick and mortar store. So again, remember a bit ago when I started the discussion of the ADA, what I said is that the provision we're talking about prohibits or says we have to remove access barriers to, and this is a quote here, places of public accommodation. Now, when you look at the law, like I do as a lawyer, and you look at some of these definitions, it really talks about physical places. It talks about offices, etc. For example, a lawyer's office is listed. Any kind of retail store is listed. All of these different places, physical places, are listed. So some courts, when they've looked at this, have said that only businesses with a physical location are subject to the ADA with respect to their website. And again, if you would have asked me a year and a half ago to just look at this in a vacuum, look at the law, does it apply to you and I if we don't have a physical space? I would have said no, it just doesn't. When I read the law, it doesn't apply. But some other courts have gone the other way. There are courts in New York that have said that any website that offers goods and or services to the public is in itself a place of public accommodation. And so the ADA rules would apply. And then there are other courts that have kind of indicated the same thing, some in the middle of the country, et cetera. So the problem is now we're in this space where it's not clear whether we have to comply with the ADA or not. Now, most of us in the legal community were hoping that we were going to get some clarity once the Justice Department actually finished those rules I talked about that they said they were going to start drafting back in 2010. Unfortunately, earlier this year, or maybe it was at the very end of 17, I don't remember the exact timing, but at some point around then, the DOJ, the Department of Justice, pulled it and said, we're not going to issue rules or regulations after all. And so now we're in this place of not knowing what the rules are, what the law is, which is not very comfortable. But what I will tell you is some law firms have started suing businesses claiming that their websites don't comply with the ADA. And so it is a risk and it's something that could affect you. Now, what I would tell you is You and I are not likely to be the primary targets. They're probably going to go after bigger people first and try to establish these different rules, but there's some chance they could come after us. And regardless of whether you're right, whether there's a good argument that we don't have to comply with the ADA, here's the problem. The problem is you probably don't want to pay me or some other lawyer tens of thousands of dollars to argue about that. And most of these lawyers are just trying to get a quick buck and get you to pay them a little bit of money. So at the end of the day, the best practice is to start making sure that your website complies with general standards for accessibility. And what I'll tell you is the good news is that we should be doing this anyway. I mean, it's just a good practice, right? We should want people who, for example, have some kind of disability with their vision, with their sight, or with hearing, or something like that. We would want them to be able to actually access our website because it's the right thing to do, quite honestly. Another thing I'll tell you is that a lot of the principles that apply and a lot of the rules and guidelines that you are going to need to apply to make your website accessible are also going to help you for SEO purposes. Now, I'm going to have an SEO episode coming up before too long, but some of the things that I know we'll talk about during that episode are what are called on-page optimization for search engine optimization. So it's things that you need to be doing in your website. And a lot of those things are the same things that you need to be doing to make your website accessible to people with disabilities. So there are benefits as well. So that's kind of the legal background and the why. The why is that we're probably required to, under kind of what's happening in the courts these days. There are risks if we don't, and actually complying with these and implementing these standards is likely to help us as a business matter as well. And you'll see some of these aren't just SEO, some of them are good design ideas as well. But that leads us kind of to the next question is, what are the rules? And there is no law out there that says, here are the things you have to do. There's no kind of checklist that you can go to a law and say, this is what it is, or a rule or regulation. So that's kind of a bummer for us. But luckily, there's kind of been a consensus coming up that we need to comply, or we should follow this kind of set of standards and guidelines. It's called the World Wide Web Consortium's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Now, that is a mouthful. It's, again, the World Wide Web Consortium's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Now, you'll often see this kind of abbreviated as WCAG. If you search the internet, that's what you're going to find it under. It's kind of a shortening of the last part. And I think World Wide Web Consortium, I think, is W3C. So you'll often see WC3, WCAG, which just confuses me even more. So they've had multiple versions. They were on version 2.0, but they released version 2.1 in 2018. And so what these guidelines say is kind of they break down, they set various guidelines and group them into 4 categories, saying generally, and here's kind of the 4 categories, that your website should be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And then each of the guidelines that kind of falls under one of those categories they've defined what they call success criterion. These are basically kind of the way you would go about doing it. Now, what gets complicated and makes it even harder is some of these are kind of set as, they have a thing. It's a single A, double A, or triple A. So it's kind of the lowest essential level, a medium level, and the highest level. What I'll tell you is I don't think anyone is meeting the highest level, because some of these, like the highest level would mean that you would have, for example, a sign language interpreter for certain things. And I don't know about you, but I haven't seen a lot of websites that had that. So I wouldn't worry about that. But what I'm going to do now is we're going to kind of go through the standards, go through these guidelines, And we're going to go through each category. Now, I am not going to go in depth through every one of the success criterion. We will, however, talk about each of the guidelines themselves, and I'll talk about some of the issues. So some of this is pretty clear and isn't a problem, but some of it, gets really down in the weeds, so we don't want to spend too much time on it. So let's start at the top with the first category, remember, is that your website should be perceivable. And basically what the idea behind this is that the information and user interface components of your website must be presentable to users in ways they can perceive. And so if you think about that, part of that means, for example, that it's going to need to be perceivable to people who can't see. So you're going to have alternatives. And then maybe there are people who can't hear. So you're going to have alternatives there. So it's kind of setting up this notion that we want it to be perceivable to people regardless of their potential disability. So let's start with guideline 1.1, which is under this first principle or first category, perceivable. And this is what they call text alternatives. And the overall arching idea is that you should provide text alternatives for any non-text content so that it can be kind of read by people who, for example, there are people who have a machine on their computer, whatever, that kind of translates websites and will actually think of it as read it to them. So for people who cannot see. So you have to have text alternatives for non-text content. That's basically a fancy way of saying, if you have pictures, for example, you need to have a text description of it. And this is a prime example of where I was talking about how SEO, so search engine optimization, good practices there are also going to apply here, because you should have a description of your images that you have on your website anyway. So that's kind of what we have in mind here. Now, there are some exceptions. So, for example, things that are purely for decoration or formatting, etc., it's not a huge problem if that's not. So, again, just imagine if you have a background that has some of that stuff on it. You don't have to worry about that. But the idea is that generally, non-text content on your web page that's more than just kind of design or decoration needs to have a text alternative. So that's guideline 1.1. That's kind of one of the simplest ones. So that's one of the easy ones we can really talk about it. Now, the next guideline is time-based media, and it is to provide alternatives for time-based media. Now, this is a way where, this is not legalese, but it's kind of the equivalent. They could have said this a lot easier. The concept here is that you should have an alternative to think of it as video. So like if you have a video, imagine if someone can't see, you potentially need to have an audio version of it. Or, for example, you should have captions for your audio content to the extent possible. Or you could have a transcript that someone, for example, if they can't listen to the audio, they could click the transcript. So it's things like that that you need to have kind of for any kind of media. And here what we're really talking about is audio and video presentations. You need to have alternatives that will allow people to access it if for whatever reason they have a disability that affects them. So again, in the case of video, you need to have an alternative if it's someone who can't see. So that might be a transcript, it might be an audio recording, etc. And then if you have an audio recording, you need to have a transcript or captions so that people who can't hear can still follow along. Those are kind of the base level. Then here's where they kind of get at higher levels of compliance. Remember I said that the guidelines kind of set out a level A, which is the the basically minimal level, a mid level, which is the AA, and then the AAA. Well, in the AA, they have things like having captions even for live videos. Now, you understand why this is not the base level, right? I don't know about you, but most of the software I use isn't going to create captions in real time for video. Again, I'm also not doing live video on my website, so it's not a big issue, but it's something to think about. Now, another is this notion of an audio description of a video, a pre-recorded video content. So instead of doing a transcript, and again, when I talk about a transcript here for a video, if it's a talking head, me just looking at the screen video, obviously transcript is just what I said is all that matters. But if it's actually, think of it more like a movie, theoretically, you would have something more like closed captions where it tells you what's happening, not just the actual spoken words. So, that's one level. And then, this higher level is having an audio description for video. This, again, at the highest level, this AAA, Ultra, Uber accessibility is where they have things like sign language. Again, that's just not, realistic, I think, and I'm not seeing people comply with that. So I don't spend too much time worrying about that. So that's kind of guideline 1.2 is have alternatives to this media so people can see it. So the basic level is make sure you have captions for your videos or a transcript, one of the two, and the same thing with audio, and that way you'll be in good shape. Then the next guideline is that they want the website to be adaptable. And so the notion here, this kind of gets a little bit complicated, but the notion is that you should create content that can be presented in different ways. For example, with a simpler layout without losing information or structure. So this can be kind of hard, but the notion, if you think about it, a lot of this hopefully will come through when you're thinking about making your website work on different devices, right? So if you have someone looking at it on a phone, often the layout that you would have had for your actual website will have to have some other pieces to it. But again, this is something where you have to kind of think through what this means exactly and how you're going to deal with it. The idea here, though, is so that someone who can't see the structure, can't see kind of the layout, can still understand what's happening, right? And so the idea is let's try to make it so that you can understand it, even if, it has to be laid out in a different way. So, this is kind of a problem with design. A lot of people would want to use design maybe to show flow, etc. You need to show information and relationships in a way that could be available in text or could be determined some other way without, for example, them being able to see the actual picture. Again, the same thing is if someone needs to be reading things in a particular order, you need to have your website set up so that it will make sure that it kind of renders in that way, even if people are putting it in a simpler way. So it's kind of ordered in the right way, even if they're using something else. So those are kind of some of the big principles here. But the idea is, even if they can't see the structure or the layout, they can, and if it was audio or something, they could still understand it, right? So make sure that it's available to people who don't have access to the layout or need it to be laid out more simply for their device. Now, guideline 1.4, and again, remember, we are still under the general notion of perceivable. And so this guideline is that things on your website should be distinguishable. So in other words, make it easier for users to see and hear content, including taking steps to kind of separate foreground from background. So again, the first part of this is one of those notions that really comes into a design element, and this is the use of color. You need enough contrast between the different elements of your website so that people can actually see it. So, part of that is, think about if you have you just need, let's take text that's laid on top of a picture or that's laid on top of a background. You need to have enough contrast so that people who, not people who are blind, but people who have, some issues with their sight will be able to make it out. Now, another part of, or something you need to think about for color is that you need to make sure that color is not used as the only visual means for conveying information or an action or, trying to get a response, etc. Because again, some people are colorblind or challenged in their color perception. And so you don't want it to be something where the only way that someone would know that they need to do something or get some information is if they can distinguish the colors, meaning it changes from red to blue or something like that. And that indicates a need for you to take action. You should not use that. Again, I don't know a lot of people who are doing that, so I don't think it's a big problem. Now, there are other issues with audio, for example. You need to have an availability for people to pause or stop audio if it plays automatically, or at least to control the volume of what's happening on your website independent of kind of your overall speakers. So in other words, and think about this, you don't want someone who goes to your website and has a screen reader operating that they can't hear that because they're hearing some music that's playing. So again, I don't know about you, but there's some websites that have music playing when you visit it. Those kind of annoy me personally because, I don't really want, anytime I go to a website to have volume blaring out. So make sure that if you have music that plays automatically for and it says more than 3 seconds, that there has to be a mechanism to stop or pause the audio or to just change the volume of that audio very easily and independent of your overall system volume. Then some of the other things is to allow resizing of text, which obviously makes sense. You don't want it to be that your website won't make any sense if they have to resize text, etc. So these are some of the ideas that you need to do it. Again, this is one where there's all kinds of extra layers when you go up to the higher levels, like there's kind of enhanced levels of contrast of colors and things like that. So the concept here, though, is very simply to make it so that someone who, for example, has a visual impairment or an auditory impairment is going to be able to still access your website. So again, think about it in those terms of making it clear and easy for people to recognize. Again, I would say all of that is a good design technique anyway. So those are the principles that fall under the perceivable category. So again, the first one is you have to have text alternatives. The second is what they call time-based media, but that's basically having alternatives for video and audio so people can access it. The next we talked about is adaptability. So this is they don't lose understanding of your website if they have to, simplify the layout for some reason. And then the final one is distinguishable, right? So that the audio and visual elements, you can kind of distinguish the relevant things. That takes us to principle 2 or category 2, which is kind of that your website is operable in the right way. And there's a few different pieces here. And the first one is a very simple one. This is something, I don't know how to do it, but guideline 2.1 is that your website and the functionality, all of it should be available from someone just using a keyboard without a mouse. So again, I don't know how to do that, but it's a principle we all need to be applying. I don't know about you, but I've lost the ability to use my keyboard to actually navigate just because I don't do it. But we need to make sure that that is done. And so we need to just check and make sure that that's done. I'm not going to deal with any level of specificity there because that's something that, you'll need to deal with kind of someone technical to help you with. The next guideline is that you provide enough time for people to read and use the content. You have to think about this. You don't want it to be where, content is flashing back and forth with no way to avoid it. So you need to have some kind of limit if you're going to have things happening. If you have some, they lose access to something, etc., they should be able to turn off the swiping or etc. And again, I'm not talking about countdown timers for an offer here. I'm talking about, let's say that you just have your website kind of automatically changing every 20 seconds or something. That is something that's problematic because people might not be able to perceive it. So you need to give them the ability to turn it off or adjust the amount of time or do something like that themselves. This doesn't apply if it's a real-time something happening in real time, obviously, and it doesn't apply if it's, it changes every, 10 days or something. If it's shorter periods. So similarly, if you have moving, blinking, scrolling, or anything like that, allow a way for people to kind of pause, stop, or hide that so that it's not an issue. You generally don't want timing to be an essential part of an event or activity unless it's required, but those are all higher levels. The point here is just make sure that your website provides enough time for people to actually be able to digest it and get the information they need. So take that seriously and do it. And again, what I'll tell you is from a design perspective, there are some people who forget any kind of impairments. They have things happening way too quickly on their website. You don't want that. Again, I think the best practices nowadays is generally you don't have any of that happening automatically. But if you do, just make sure there are ways to stop it and so that people can actually get access to it. Then again, guideline 2.3, this one is pretty self-explanatory. It's basically don't design content in a way that could cause someone to have a seizure or physical reaction. Again, we've all heard about folks with epilepsy who a strobing light can give them a seizure. So again, you basically need to make sure that your website doesn't have strobing lights on it. Again, from a design perspective, I think that'd be pretty bad anyway, but just make sure that you're not doing that. And that's the really big piece here. The next guideline, 2.4, is that your website needs to be navigable. So provide ways to help users navigate, find content, and determine where they are. Again, this is a good design technique as well. There's a couple of ways you can do this. You can, first of all, you should have menus that allow people to navigate to find the content. You could have a search bar that would help people do that. You could have breadcrumbs activated if you wanted to, if you have a bunch of sub pages under things, etc. So you could do that. But the notion is make your website easy to navigate, but also there's some other things in here. So for example, one of the success criterion, even at the base level, says that the purpose of each link can be determined from the link text alone or from the link text together with kind of the context. So in other words, if you're linking to something in your web page, someone needs to be able to understand where you're going and why it's happening. So again, that's a good principle for SEO purposes as well, but you need to do it to meet these criteria as well. So that's kind of one example here. But the other concept is just make your website easy to navigate. I mean, I think these days, most of us are not putting pages nested in pages that are nested in another page, meaning like 3 and 4 levels down on kind of a table of contents. If you are, you just need to make sure it's very easy to navigate through it. Again, another kind of principle they lay out is that it's good to use headings and labels to make sure that it's easy to understand these things and to title your pages so that people can understand where they are. So some basic principles here that are also generally good for us to use to just help people generally. Now, next, we are getting to guideline 2.5. And guideline 2.5 is something that was basically kind of, has come in new in this latest version, but it's about input modalities is what they call it. And what it means is that you have to make it easier for users to operate functionality through various inputs beyond a keyboard. So kind of before we talked about you needed people to be able to use your keyboard to actually access everything. Now, at the same time, this is saying we need to make it possible for people to be able to access our website with only pointer gestures, for example. So that's kind of the backside again. And most of this is not going to be a problem, but you just need to make it easy for people to be able to do this and to be able to kind of get this done. And so, there are some levels here of you don't want your, pointers to be too difficult, but you want to make it easy for them to do this. So that then is kind of the end of principle 2 or principle 2, which is that the website needs to be operable. And the basic concept here is, hey, it's going to be, possible for people to use it, to understand where they are. They're going to have enough time, and you're not going to have things that are going to make it, physical reactions come. Now, the next piece is that your website needs to be understandable. And so it's that the information and the operation of the user interface must be understandable. So there's a few different principles or guidelines here in this principle. And guideline 3.1 is that it's readable. So make text content readable and understandable. Again, this to me is not something that necessarily difficult for people to understand, because we need our website to be understandable or readable. If you think about it, this is partly so that, someone could use a system to help them be able to understand it, but also generally so that people can understand it. This one, they have some higher level requirements here, like, that you would have at the AAA level, so the very highest level of compliance, you would have a way to identify words or phrases that are kind of used in a weird way, including idioms and jargon. Again, I think a lot of us are using those things. Hopefully we're not using too much of it, but people are using it obviously, and they're not putting definitions. Again, that's the AAA level. So I don't think that's something you have to worry about too much. But the point is, generally make your website readable. Again, we should all be doing that anyway. There's a great app, I think it's called the Hemingway app, that you can put text into and it will give you whether it's readable and at what level. So that's a good rule of thumb to be using anyway. So the next guideline here for understandable is make web pages is that they're predictable. So you want to make your web pages appear and operate in predictable ways. The notion is you want people to be able to actually understand what's happening and that they can still access it, that navigation stays the same, that when someone focuses on a part of the page, that's not going to make it change or lose context or things like that. So, the idea behind this one is that you don't, for example, have a new window open as soon as a page is loaded, right? So you don't have a bunch of pop-ups coming up, and you don't want to be using a script that's kind of going to remove focus when focus is first coming into view. So think about those kinds of things. Another thing that you need to do is often you want, for input levels, you want it to be that people have to click a button or do something before action happens. I don't know. This drives me nuts I've forgotten what it is. I think it's my social media scheduler. When I start typing, like as soon as I type www dot and then one other letter, it does something and it messes everything up and it kind of screws things up, and that drives me nuts. Instead, don't do that, right? I mean, use a submit button or use some kind of button or action other than the mere inputting of data to kind of change context. The notion is you want people to kind of be able to flow through and do these things as they're putting information in without there being a problem. Now, then again, at the higher levels, the things they want you to understand is kind of that, like, you have consistent navigation between pages. So in other words, kind of, that your navigation on your web page is within, kind of your website kind of occur generally the same. So it's not going to confuse people, which makes sense. Again, that just seems like good practice to me generally. So think about that to make it consistent so people know what to expect. So the other thing then is the next guideline is input assistance. So this is help users avoid and correct mistakes. So part of this is, one of the ideas here is that if your system can automatically detect an error, tell them. So an example of this, for example, if you have an input, and hopefully your email service provider landing page software is doing this automatically, right? If someone has to put an email address in a field, you should have it so that it will detect if what they put is not an email address. And so it'll say, hey, no, you need to give me an email address here. So that will, automatically show that there's an error. Again, your system should be doing that. But if you were doing something like trying to just use like a Survey Monkey survey or some kind of, Google Forms or Google, I don't remember what Google's equivalent is, but, where you could have a questionnaire from them rather than an ESP or an email service provider to do this, you might have this be an issue. But you need, if an error is detected, that you tell them the error. Some of the other things, obviously, you need to put labels where people are going to put information to explain them what they need to put, and to suggest a fix if it sees an error, et cetera. So that's pretty responsive, pretty easy to understand. You just need to give some people some guidance on what they're putting in and tell them if you find an error. Again, there can be some higher levels. This is not an issue that should really trip you up. So that's kind of it within the understandable principle 3, which is that your website's understandable. So it needs to be readable. Again, understandable language. It needs to be predictable so people can really understand what's happening and predict where things are going to go. And then input assistance. Again, in my view, this is an area that really should not trip you up because all of these areas, readable, predictable, input assistance, we should be doing anyway, regardless of the ADA. Now, then the final piece here is principle 4, which is robust. And so the idea is that the content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. So that's kind of, hard to understand that principle, but let's go into the guideline. And there's only one guideline here. It's compatible. And so it's maximize compatibility with current and future user agents, including assistive technologies. So this is things like parsing. Again, we don't have to worry about this, right? Because our systems should be doing this. So I'm not going to bore you with the details here, but your website system that's rendering it, your HTML code, all of that should have the right parsing so that people, so that their technologies can use it, right? That's kind of the way things are using it. There's something called a start and end tag. All of that should be done automatically. You don't have to worry about this in my view. It just should not be it shouldn't be a problem. But the point is that you just need to make sure that you're using systems that are in fact going to be compatible. Again, I don't think robust is a problem. So that's kind of the last principle, the last guideline, et cetera. What I'm going to tell you is most of the issues here from an ADA perspective are going to come up back in principles 1 and 2. Because principles 3 and 4 are more just about general good practice, and we should be doing it anyway. You really shouldn't have an issue with it. Really, what you have to be thinking about for ADA compliance is backup and making your website perceivable and making it operable. And so perceivable is making sure that you have the stuff, the information there for people who have some kind of challenge, whether it's they can't see or have eyesight problems, or they have problems with hearing or something like that, or they are colorblind or anything like that, so that they're still going to be able to understand what's on your website based on whatever system and technology they're using. And then the operability standard, make sure that, again, they're able to actually navigate with it. Again, most of that should be done by your system without you having to worry about it. But some of it is timing, making sure that you don't prevent people from being able to kind of stop actions, etc. So now that is it. That is a lot of stuff to cover. What I'm going to put in the show notes is a link, and it's a link to, so it's the guidelines from information, or from the site, from the W3, so kind of from the World Wide Web Consortium. So it's the actual quick reference guide that will help you understand these things. It's kind of a walks through the guidelines. It has techniques and failures, so it kind of talks about what you should do and what's not acceptable, etc. Again, a lot of this stuff is kind of technical, and a lot of this stuff is not going to be an issue. But if you want to dig into it, that's going to be that's going to be the best way to do it. Or you can talk to a web expert, and they can make sure that you understand that all this is taken care of. So again, I will have a link in the show notes to the W3C's website and the quick reference guide on this. So my advice at the end of the day focus on the first level of things, making sure that you have the right, kind of captions, which is something we all need to be working about, transcripts and text alternatives to pictures and images and things like that. And then make sure that your website has good contrast, etc., so that it's easy to understand. And then make sure it's navigable. If you do those two things, you're going to be most of the way there, and most likely you're not going to have a problem. So that's where I would focus my time if I were you. So that's it for this episode. We've covered a lot. I think this is an issue that's going to continue to expand. And I may at some point try to bring an expert on this particular thing, meaning on how to actually implement it on to give a lesson. But for now, I wanted to give you an overview of what the concepts are so that you can understand them. If you have any questions, obviously you know where to find me. In the weeks to come, we're going to be talking more about content. We're going to get away from this kind of technical stuff and back to what you probably want to hear mainly about, which is building your content strategy and doing things like blogging and podcasting and creating all of these different things. And it's going to help you to build that overall strategy. And again, that's it for this week's episode. But don't forget to join the Online Genius community by heading over to youronlinegenius.com/community. That's where we'll be kind of talking more about these issues. And also that's where you can ping me. If you listen to this and say, I want to know a little bit more about, guideline 1.4, and I'm picking that out of the air here, but you get the point. If there's a particular guideline you want to talk about, how does that apply or something like that, that'll be the place to do it. We can have a discussion there about it, and it'll be very helpful. So again, youronlinegenius.com/community, and we can have that discussion there. And I'll see you back here next week for episode 55 of the Online Genius Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Online Genius Podcast. Make sure to tune in next week for more great tips, tricks, and strategies to help you build and protect your online genius.